I'd like to welcome Mr. Benedict Rogers. Mr. Rogers is the East Asia team leader at Christian Solidarity Worldwide. He's the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission and is a member of the advisory group of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, IPAC. He's also the co-founder and chair of Hong Kong Watch. So, Mr. Rogers, when you're ready, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you're able to bring David Maters back. But I'm happy to speak now. It's a privilege to be with you on this distinguished panel, and particularly this is such a timely event for two reasons. Firstly, of course, I know that today marks the 21st anniversary of the beginning of the persecution of Falun Gong, and I express my solidarity with Falun Gong practitioners as you commemorate this day. But it's also such a timely event because I think this year, for the first time in a very long time, people are now trying to, as the title of this webinar says, to understand the Chinese Communist Party. And I think four things in particular have brought that about. The first is the COVID-19 pandemic and the realization that the Chinese Communist Party, instead of suppressing the virus, suppressed the truth and tried to silence the whistleblowers. Secondly, the total breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration in Hong Kong. And thirdly, the news coming out of Xinjiang about the mass atrocities perpetrated against the Uyghurs. And in addition to that, the issues that Dr. Spalding has highlighted, and particularly the debate we've had in this country on Huawei. So all of those issues, I think, have brought an awakening, and it is therefore very good that you're holding this webinar today. I should, before I go into some of the issues that I'd like to highlight, viewers may wonder why I have Winnie the Pooh sitting on the bookshelf behind me. And I have him there not particularly because I'm fond of cuddly toys, but rather because in 2018, Winnie the Pooh was banned from China. And in 2017, less than a year before Winnie the Pooh was banned, I myself was denied entry to Hong Kong on the orders of Beijing. And I've also, as I'm sure a number of us have, been the recipient of a number of harassing letters and emails, and the Chinese embassy has lobbied British members of parliament, tried to lobby British members of parliament to tell me to stop speaking out on these issues. And I think that if we're to understand the Chinese Communist Party, the fact that a regime that projects itself with great confidence as a superpower in the world, at the same time bans Winnie the Pooh, bans someone like me, sends intimidatory letters and emails, suggests that the Chinese Communist Party actually is not based on confidence, but it, in fact, is a lot more insecure than we may perhaps realize. I've been involved with China for many years. I first went to China when I was 18 years old, and I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover from 1997 to 2002. And one of the things I should say from the outset is that I am deeply pro-China in terms of the country and the people. I am not anti-China. I am critical of the Chinese Communist Party regime. And I think it's really important, as we discuss these issues, to distinguish between that regime and the people that it represses so brutally. I thought I would just make a few remarks on the human rights situation in China today, because I think that we are seeing the worst crackdown on human rights across the board since the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. In terms of the suppression of civil society, of bloggers, of dissidents, of human rights lawyers, human rights defenders. But then and the situation in Hong Kong, which I'll come back to. But then when it comes to religion or religion and belief, I think we may be seeing the worst situation, the worst crackdown actually since the Cultural Revolution. The organization that I work for full-time, CSW, which works for freedom of religion or belief for all, and we've very actively defended the rights of Falun Gong practitioners. We've highlighted the issues of organ harvesting, but also the situation for Tibetans, for Uyghurs, for Christians. We published a report earlier this year called Repressed, Removed and Re-Educated, the Stranglehold on Religious Life in China today. And I just thought I would share two quotes from this report from two different people, but saying essentially the same thing. The first is from Pastor Wang Yi from the Early Rain Church, who just after Christmas was jailed for 9 years on charges of subversion, simply for saying in a sermon that Xi Jinping is not God. And to make that observation is apparently a subversive act. But he said before his imprisonment that the Chinese Communist Party is launching a war against the soul. In Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Chengdu, the rulers of this country are launching a war, but they have established for themselves an enemy that can never be detained, can never be destroyed, will never capitulate nor be conquered, and that is the soul of man. And then the US Ambassador for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, last year said something very similar. He said it seems that the Chinese government is at war with faith, but it is a war that they will not win. The Chinese Communist Party must hear the cry of its people for religious freedom. So I thought I'd just unpack some of those issues, starting with the particularly topical and absolutely egregious situation of the Uyghurs. I don't propose to talk about Falun Gong because others on this panel, I'm sure, will go into greater detail. But please know that I very much follow and work on the persecution of Falun Gong. But because others I know will highlight that, let's look at the plight of the Uyghurs. And I think that although there has been no legal body that has determined that it is genocide, nevertheless, if you look at the Genocide Convention, and I say this as a non-lawyer, it seems to me that pretty much every act that makes up genocide is happening against the Uyghurs. And the Washington Post a couple of years ago now said that from the Chinese government's own statements, there are signs of genocidal intent. The British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said just yesterday on the Andrew Marr program, he stopped short of using genocide, but he said we are seeing gross and egregious atrocities committed. At least 1 million, perhaps as many as 3 million Uyghurs in prison camps. The rollout of what has to be the world's most Orwellian surveillance state in Xinjiang in particular, and of course extending throughout China, the destruction of mosques, Uyghurs who have beards of a certain length being thrown into a prison camp simply because of their beard, women wearing headscarves being accused of extremism, Uyghur Muslims being prohibited from fasting during Ramadan or being forced to drink alcohol or eat pork. And, of course, the recent revelations by Adrian Zenz of a campaign of forced sterilization and birth control. And that's just a snapshot of the Uyghur crisis. But if you look at what's happening to Christians, we're also seeing, I think, the worst assault on Christians since the Cultural Revolution. We've seen thousands of crosses destroyed and churches dynamited or closed. Just last month, Xinguang Church in Xiamen was raided. Increasing number of arrests. I've mentioned Pastor Wang Yi, but also Pastor Zhao Huiguo from the Bethel Church in Hunan, arrested in April. And pretty much every week we get reports of arrests and churches raided. One issue I'd like to highlight briefly is that we're coming up to the second anniversary of the deal that was signed between the Vatican and Beijing, a deal that I've been very critical of from the start. And one of the tragedies of that agreement is that if it had resulted in some improvement for the lives of at least Catholics and if not wider Christians and others, then one could perhaps be a bit more sympathetic to it. But the reality is that agreement has resulted in a worsening of the situation for Catholics, certainly no improvement. There have been a number of arrests. Just recently, the coadjutor bishop of Xuanhua, Augustine Cui Tai, a 70-year-old bishop, was arrested. Father Su Guipeng is under house arrest. Numerous other Catholic priests and bishops continue to be detained. And one of the key things that I think was a major error in that deal was that if I had been negotiating such an agreement, a criteria for an agreement should have been the release of Catholics, Catholic lay people and clergy in prison before the agreement took place. Whether there was any attempt to negotiate that, I don't know, but certainly it wasn't achieved. Nobody's been released, and there have been more imprisonments since that deal. So I and I can say this speaking as a Catholic, have been extremely critical of the Vatican. And I just add to that two other things. That deal is still secret. We don't know the details of it. We do know it gives the Chinese Communist Party a role in choosing bishops, which seems in itself a peculiar thing to do, given that the Chinese Communist Party is a avowedly atheist party. But it also appears to have brought the silence of the Vatican, because even though Pope Francis speaks pretty much every week on an issue of injustice around the world, there has been a deafening silence on any of the issues in China, whether it be the Uyghurs, the persecution of Christians, Hong Kong, organ harvesting, Tibet. We haven't heard him say anything or even express a prayer for these situations. If we turn just briefly to the situation in the state-controlled churches, the Chinese Communist Party has always, of course, been opposed to religion, but there was a period from the time of after the Mao era until Xi Jinping, where there was a certain amount of space for religion, albeit controlled, and the Communist Party's objective appeared to move from the goal of eliminating religion to, when it realized it couldn't achieve that, the goal of controlling religion. Within that policy of control, for a long time, it seemed to depend on the attitudes of provincial authorities. So there would be different parts of China where things would be a bit more relaxed, where Christians could meet in small numbers, even if they were unregistered, in house churches, in people's homes. And depending on the attitude of the local authority, as long as they weren't large numbers, they were often, a blind eye was turned. That seems to have changed under Xi Jinping, and he has taken a close interest in policy on religion, convening a number of high-level conferences on the issue, but really directing policy from the center. And so we've seen in the state-controlled churches under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, an extraordinary rollout of Communist Party propaganda, churches being required to display Communist Party banners alongside or sometimes instead of religious symbols, displaying pictures of Xi Jinping and other leaders, surveillance cameras in those churches recording those who are attending services, the introduction of new revised regulations on religion in 2018, which tighten repression even further, the prohibition of under 18s from going to places of worship, and even discussion of rewriting or retranslating the Bible, and I think it applies to the Quran as well, to bring religious texts into line with Chinese Communist Party thought and propaganda. The president of the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association, which is the Chinese Communist Party's controlled body, Bishop John Fang Xingyao, said these words: "Love for the homeland must be greater than love for the church." And when he says homeland, I think he really means the party. And law of the country, meaning the party, is above canon law. Let me just, before I close, touch on two other aspects of this all-out assault on human rights and on religion in particular. We marked this year the 5th anniversary, just last month, of the 709 crackdown on human rights lawyers and human rights defenders, where in July 2015, 300 human rights lawyers and their associates, and in some cases their families and other human rights defenders working with them, were rounded up and arrested. And many of those human rights defenders were jailed or disbarred or disappeared. They used to have a certain amount of space, of course, with red lines, of course, limited. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party has always been repressive, but nevertheless, until the 709 crackdown, there was a certain space where human rights lawyers could defend Christians, and if they were really brave, Falun Gong practitioners and others, and function as lawyers to a limited degree, and that space has just disappeared. And then I close by turning to the situation in Hong Kong, because we have seen the flagrant breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, the tearing up of one country, two systems, and the expansion of the Chinese Communist Party's apparatus of repression into what until recently was still a relatively free and open society, although its freedoms have been steadily eroded over the last 5 or 6 years. But we now see Hong Kong, under the new national security law, at risk of losing all its basic freedoms that were promised to Hong Kong at the handover 23 years ago. Freedom of expression, association, assembly, media freedom, academic freedom will all be affected. And I think religious freedom will certainly be affected as well. I would imagine Falun Gong practitioners in Hong Kong, who until recently, it was the one part of China where Falun Gong practitioners could function relatively freely, although I know there have been issues, but they must now be in danger now. I think that we will see monitoring of sermons in churches and other religious groups that only last year were taking part in candlelit vigils in support of the protest movement, presumably could find themselves on the wrong side of the law if they do that, or if they give sanctuary to protesters. So every aspect of freedom in Hong Kong is now in very grave danger, and I think hopefully we'll have a chance to look at those issues when we come to a time of questions. I just end with one anecdote, which I think illustrates what we need to understand about the Chinese Communist Party. Actually, before I share this anecdote, I should say one thing that we surely now must understand by the Chinese Communist Party's breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration is that it cannot be trusted, and that must apply to all its obligations under other international treaties. If it rips up one treaty, how can we trust its word on any other? But my anecdote, which I close with, is that last year I attended a Catholic gathering in the Catholic pilgrimage site of Fatima in Portugal. And with us at that gathering were two of Hong Kong's most prominent figures on the pro-democracy side, who happened to both be Catholics, the father of the democracy movement, Martin Lee, and the Cardinal Joseph Zen. And this gathering was a private gathering. It was invitation only. It was closed door. There were no media there. But somehow the Chinese authorities found out about it and found out that these two figures were joining this event. And they did everything they could to put pressure on the organizers of the event to disinvite Martin Li and Cardinal Zen. When they were not successful with that, the Chinese embassy in Lisbon sent a delegation of, I think, at least a dozen Chinese diplomats to Fatima. They hired the entire first floor of the hotel directly opposite the venue of this closed-door gathering, and they made numerous attempts to infiltrate our venue. And those attempts, thankfully, were thwarted by the organizers' security and Portuguese police. But if the Chinese Communist Party is prepared to go to such lengths to disrupt a small Catholic gathering in a European pilgrimage site just because two octogenarian Hong Kong Democrats and critics of the regime were in attendance, then that shows both the insecurity of the Chinese Communist Party, but also how much worse is it in within their own borders, where they will go to horrific lengths to silence dissent. And so we have to understand, to use a word that the last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, used in a recent letter to the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, we have to understand that the Chinese Communist Party is extremely brutal. It has become even more repressive within its own borders, particularly aggressive beyond its borders, and is a party that is based on mendacity, which is a polite way of saying that it is based on lies. And so with that, I'll conclude and look forward to coming back to some of these issues in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers.